long before the first stone was laid upon another, long before princes claimed thrones or priests raised golden crosses toward heaven. The land that would become Kiev existed in a state of primordial stillness. The great river moved through the earth as it had for countless millennia, carving its path southward toward distant seas. Dense forests of oak and pine stretched in every direction, broken only by meadows where wild grasses bent beneath winds that carried no name. This was the Dnieper, the ancient waterway that would one day serve as the spine of an empire. But in those earliest ages, it was simply water finding its way through wilderness, indifferent to the futures that would unfold along its banks. The hills rose gently from the western shore, a series of elevations that offered natural vantage points over the river below. These were not mountains, but rather soft undulations in the landscape, forested heights where one could stand and see for great distances across the flowing water and the flatlands beyond. Something about this particular arrangement of earth and river created conditions unlike any other place along the Dnieper's enormous length. The hills provided defense. The river provided sustenance and movement. The surrounding lands provided game and timber and soil that could be worked. Here was a convergence of gifts from the earth itself. Archaeological traces suggest that human beings recognized these advantages long before recorded history began. Stone tools scattered across the hilltops speak of hunters who paused here during migrations that predate any civilization we can name. The earliest settlements were temporary, perhaps seasonal camps where groups gathered to fish the abundant waters or to hunt the animals that came to drink at the river's edge. These were not yet villages, not yet permanent arrangements of human life, but rather recurring visits to a place that offered something essential. Generation after generation, people returned to these hills without quite settling upon them. The Dnieper itself was more than a source of water and fish. It was a highway through a world without roads, a navigable passage that connected distant regions in ways that overland travel could not match. From its sources in the northern forests near what would become Smolensk, the river flowed southward through marshlands and steppes until it emptied into the Black Sea. Anyone who controlled a strategic point along this waterway held power over movement itself. Traders, warriors, migrants, and messengers all depended upon the river's current to carry them toward their destinations. The hills above Kiev sat at a natural crossing point. It's a place where the river could be forded or ferried with relative ease. Centuries passed in patterns we cannot fully reconstruct. Waves of peoples moved through the region, some leaving traces and some vanishing without record. The Scythians roamed the steppes to the south, their mounted warriors legendary throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Greek colonies dotted the Black Sea coast, and their merchants surely traveled northward along the Dnieper in search of furs, honey, and amber. The Romans knew of this river and the lands beyond it, though their empire never extended so far. Each civilization that touched the edges of this territory added another thread to the tapestry of influence that would eventually produce the cultures of the medieval age. By the early centuries of the Common Era, Slavic peoples had begun their slow expansion across the forests and plains of Eastern Europe. They came from somewhere in the region between the Vistula and the Dnieper, though scholars still debate the precise boundaries of their original homeland. These were agricultural people who cleared forests, built villages of wooden homes, and worshipped gods associated with the forces of nature. They did not write, so they left no chronicles of their own movements and settlements. What we know of them comes from the observations of outsiders and from the silent testimony of graves and ruined structures uncovered by modern archaeology. Among the Slavic tribes that settled in the Middle Dnieper region were the Polans, whose name derived from the word for field or open land. They established themselves on the very hills that would become Kiev, building their homes and their shrines on the elevated ground above the river. The Polans were farmers and traders, people who understood both the rhythms of agriculture and the opportunities presented by the great waterway at their doorstep. They maintained connections with neighboring tribes, sometimes peaceful and sometimes hostile. In the complex web of relationships that characterized Slavic society before the coming of princes and kingdoms, the world of the Polans was animated by forces both visible and invisible. They saw divinity in the thunderstorm, in the sun's warmth, in the rivers that sustained their crops, and in the forest that sheltered game. Their priests made offerings at sacred groves and hilltop shrines, seeking favor from powers that controlled fertility, weather, and fortune in war. Ancestors remained present in the lives of the living, honored through rituals and remembered through the oral traditions that each generation passed to the next. This was a spiritual landscape, as real and immediate as the physical terrain, a world in which every grove and spring might harbor supernatural presence. The legend of Kiev's founding emerges from this pre-literate world, preserved through centuries of oral transmission before finally being written down in the chronicles of a much later age. According to this tradition, 3 brothers and their sister established a settlement that would grow into the great city. The names were Kiev, Shek, Koriv, K. Each brother gave his name to one of the hills upon which the settlement stood, while their sister's name was given to the small river that flowed nearby. Kiev was the eldest, and from his name came the name of the city itself. He was said to have been a ferryman who operated the crossing of the Dnieper, or perhaps a prince who ruled over the early settlement, depending on which version of the legend one accepts. The chronicle, known as the Primary Chronicle, compiled by monks in the 11th and 12th centuries, records this founding legend while acknowledging uncertainty about its details. The chronicler notes that some said Kiev was merely a ferryman, but he argues against this interpretation, insisting that a simple boatman would not have been honored with a city bearing his name. He presents Kiev as a figure of authority who traveled to Constantinople and was received with honor by the Byzantine emperor, turning home with glory and establishing his settlement on the Dnieper hills. Whether any historical kernel lies beneath these stories remains impossible to determine with certainty. What matters about the legend is not its literal truth, but what it reveals about how later generations understood their own origins. The story of 4 siblings founding a city together suggests themes of unity, of family bonds as the foundation of community, of names persisting through time as monuments to founders who might otherwise be forgotten. The inclusion of a sister among the founders speaks to the importance of women in early Slavic society, even if their roles were often overshadowed in later patriarchal structures. The connection to Constantinople hints at the city's eventual destiny as a bridge between the Slavic world and Byzantine civilization. Beyond the legends, the strategic importance of the site ensured that it would grow regardless of who first recognized its potential. The Dnieper's course created a natural corridor for trade between the Baltic Sea in the north and the Black Sea in the south. Whoever held the hills above the river controlled not only a crossing point, but also a node in a network of exchange that would eventually span from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. Furs trapped in the northern forests, honey and wax gathered from countless hives, amber collected along distant Baltic shores, all flowed southward toward markets where such goods commanded high prices. Arab geographers and Byzantine chroniclers began to mention the Dnieper region in their accounts of the world beyond their own borders. They described the Slavic peoples in terms that mixed curiosity with condescension, noting their customs, their appearance, and their pagan religious practices. These outsiders understood that somewhere in the forests of the north lay sources of valuable commodities, and that rivers served as the routes by which those commodities reached civilized markets. The specific settlement on the hills was not yet significant enough to merit individual attention, but the broader region had entered the awareness of literate civilizations to the south. The trade that passed through the Dnieper corridor carried more than physical goods. Ideas traveled along the same routes, as did technologies, artistic styles, and religious concepts. Contact with the Byzantine world meant exposure to Christianity, to Greek learning, and to the elaborate political traditions of an empire that traced its lineage back to Rome. Contact with the Islamic world through merchants and travelers brought knowledge of Arabic science, philosophy, and the sophisticated commercial practices of cultures that had already developed banking, credit, and long-distance trade networks spanning continents. The settlement on the hills absorbed these influences gradually, transforming over generations from a simple village into something larger and more complex. Wooden walls began to enclose the hilltops, providing defense against raiders and rivals. A market developed where goods could be exchanged, where foreign merchants might find lodging and local products. Craftsmen established workshops producing pottery, metalwork, and other items for trade or local use. The population grew as the settlement's prosperity attracted migrants seeking opportunity and safety within its protected spaces. Yet, Kiev, in these earliest centuries, remained one possibility among many, a promising site that had not yet fulfilled its potential. Other settlements along the Dnieper competed for prominence. Other tribes and peoples pressed at the boundaries of Slavic territory, sometimes as enemies and sometimes as potential allies. The future that would see Kiev become the mother of Russian cities. The spiritual heart of Orthodox Slavdom was not predetermined. It would require particular historical circumstances, particular leaders, and particular choices to transform a hilltop trading post into the capital of a civilization. The stage was set, but the drama had not yet begun. The Dnieper continued its ancient flow toward the sea. The hills stood above the western bank, watching over the movement of waters and the passage of seasons. The Polans tended their fields, honored their gods, and lived their lives according to patterns established by their ancestors. And somewhere, far to the north, in the misty reaches of Scandinavia, people known as the Varangians were preparing to embark upon journeys that would transform the entire region. They did not yet know of Kiev, and Kiev did not yet know of them, but the currents of history were already carrying them toward each other, toward a meeting that would reshape the map of medieval Europe. The hills waited, as they had waited for millennia. The river flowed, as it would continue to flow long after all the empires built along its banks had crumbled into memory. And in that waiting, in that patient persistence of geography, lay the foundation upon which everything that followed would be constructed. Kiev existed first as a place, as a particular arrangement of earth and water that invited human settlement. Only later would it become a name, a symbol, a capital, a mother of cities. But before all of that, there was simply this landscape. These hills, this river, and the human communities that had begun to recognize what might be built here. The transformation began with strangers arriving from the north, warriors and merchants whose longships cut through waters that connected the Baltic to the heart of the continent. They called themselves by various names, but the Slavic peoples who encountered them would come to know them as Varangians, a term that encompassed the Norse adventurers who ventured eastward in search of silver, slaves, and glory. These were the same people who terrorized the coasts of Western Europe, the Vikings whose raids brought fire to monasteries from Ireland to Italy. But those who turned their prows toward the rising sun found a different world awaiting them, a world of vast rivers that offered pathways deeper into the earth than any sea voyage could provide. The Scandinavian homelands produced fierce warriors but limited wealth. The rocky coasts and dense forests of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark could not support growing populations hungry for the luxuries that trade with distant civilizations might provide. Young men sought fortunes beyond their fathers' farms, and the technology of their age made such seeking possible. The longship was a marvel of engineering, shallow drafted enough to navigate rivers, yet sturdy enough to cross open seas. With oars and sails, these vessels could travel almost anywhere that water flowed. carrying crews of warriors who were equally prepared to trade peacefully or to take by force what they desired. The eastern route offered particular attractions. Beyond the Baltic lay river systems that penetrated deep into territories rich with the commodities that fetched high prices in distant markets. Furs of sable, ermine, beaver, and fox could be obtained from the endless forests. Honey and wax flowed from hives maintained by forest-dwelling peoples. Amber, that golden fossil resin prized since ancient times, could be gathered along certain shores. And most valuable of all, human beings could be captured and transported to slave markets, where Byzantine and Arab buyers paid handsomely for northern captives. The rivers were highways to wealth for those bold enough to travel them. The route that would become known as the road from the Varangians to the Greeks began at the Baltic shores and followed a chain of waterways southward toward Constantinople. Traders and raiders would sail up the rivers that emptied into the Baltic. Portage their ships overland were necessary, and then descend the great rivers flowing toward the Black Sea. The Dnieper was the most important of these southward flowing waterways, and any settlement that controlled a strategic point along its course held power over the traffic passing through. The hills where the Polans had built their homes stood at precisely such a point, and it was only a matter of time before the Varangians recognized what the Slavic inhabitants had long understood. The earliest Varangian contacts with the Slavic lands remain obscured by the mists of time and the limitations of our sources. The primary chronicle, written centuries after the events it describes, tells of how the Slavic tribes initially expelled the Varangians who had demanded tribute from them, only to fall into such devastating internal conflicts that they eventually invited the Northmen to return and rule over them. According to this account, the Slavs sent a delegation to the Varangians with a remarkable message, declaring that their land was great and abundant, but lacked order, and asking for princes to come and reign over them. 3 brothers answered this call, the eldest of whom was Rurik, who established himself at Novgorod and became the ancestor of the dynasty that would rule the eastern Slavic lands for 7 centuries. Whether this invitation legend reflects historical reality or represents later propaganda designed to legitimize foreign rule remains a matter of scholarly debate. What seems certain is that Varangian warriors did establish themselves as rulers over Slavic populations during the 9th century, creating a ruling elite that would gradually merge with the people they governed. The term Rus, which would eventually give its name to Russia itself, appears to have originated as a designation for these Scandinavian newcomers, though its precise etymology continues to generate controversy. Some scholars derive it from a Finnish word for Swedes, others from an Old Norse term meaning those who row. Whatever its origin, the name Rus came to identify the political entity that emerged from the fusion of Varangian leadership and Slavic population. The chronicle tells us that after Rurik's death, a kinsman named Oleg assumed guardianship over Rurik's young son, Igor, and set about expanding the territories under Rus' control. Oleg was a figure of ambition and cunning, a warrior prince who understood that the true prize lay not in Novgorod, but far to the south, where the Dnieper offered access to the riches of Byzantium. Around the year 882, Oleg led his forces southward along the river routes, conquering or absorbing the Slavic tribes in his path. When he reached the hills above the Dnieper, where Kiev stood, he found the settlement ruled by 2 Varangian warriors named Askold and Dir, who had established themselves there independently of Rurik's authority. The transfer of power was accomplished through treachery rather than open battle. Oleg concealed his warriors and approached the city in the guise of merchants, sending word to Askold and Dir that fellow Varangians had arrived with goods to trade and wished to meet with them. When the 2 rulers came out to greet the supposed merchants, Oleg's men revealed themselves and slew the unsuspecting princes. With this act of deception and murder, Oleg seized Kiev and declared it the mother of Russian cities, establishing it as the capital of a realm that would grow to dominate the Eastern Slavic world. The year 882, thus marks the traditional founding of Kiev and Rus, though the city itself was far older and would continue to evolve under its new masters. Oleg chose Kiev as his capital, not for sentimental reasons, but for strategic ones. The city's position along the Dnieper placed it at the heart of the trade network that connected northern forests to southern seas. From Kiev, a prince could control the movement of goods and tribute flowing in both directions along the great river. The surrounding agricultural lands could support a substantial population, while the hills provided natural defensive advantages. Moreover, Kiev lay closer to Constantinople than Novgorod did, making it a better base from which to pursue the glittering wealth of the Byzantine Empire. Oleg understood that the real power in his world radiated from that ancient city on the Bosphorus, and he intended to draw as close to that power as possible. The relationship between the Rus and Byzantium oscillated between commerce and conflict, sometimes combining both within a single expedition. Oleg himself led a massive raid against Constantinople in 997, according to the chronicle, arriving with a fleet so vast that it darkened the waters before the imperial city. The Byzantines sealed the entrance to their harbor with a great chain, but Oleg supposedly ordered his ships mounted on wheels and rolled overland to bypass the obstacle. Whether this particular detail is historical fact or legendary embellishment, the expedition achieved its purpose. The terrified Byzantines negotiated a treaty granting the Rus favorable trading privileges and paying substantial tribute to make the Northmen go away. The treaties between the Rus and Byzantium provide some of our earliest documentary evidence for the emerging state centered at Kiev. The Agreement of 911, preserved in the Chronicle, details the rights and obligations of Rus merchants visiting Constantinople. They were to be housed in a specific quarter, given food and supplies by the imperial government, and allowed to trade freely in the markets of the city. In exchange, they were forbidden to carry weapons within Constantinople's walls, and were required to enter the city in groups no larger than 50 men. These provisions reflect the uneasy balance between the commercial value of northern trade and the military threat that armed Northmen represented. Oleg's successor, Igor, continued the patterns established by the founder. He launched his own raid against Constantinople in 941. Though this expedition ended in disaster when Byzantine forces deployed their terrifying secret weapon, the mysterious substance known as Greek fire. This liquid flame could burn even on water, and the Byzantine navy used it to devastating effect against the wooden ships of the Rus fleet. Survivors who reached shore were captured and executed, while Igor himself barely escaped with a remnant of his forces. The defeat demonstrated that the Byzantine Empire, though it preferred to buy off attackers when possible, retained formidable military capabilities when pushed to extremity. Igor eventually perished, not in battle against Byzantium, but while extracting tribute from a Slavic tribe called the Drevlians. Having collected his customary payment, he greedily returned to demand more, whereupon the outraged Drevlians captured and killed him, reportedly by bending 2 trees down, tying his legs to them, and releasing the trees to tear him apart. This gruesome death left his son Sviatoslav as heir, but the boy was too young to rule. Power passed to Igor's widow, Olga, who would prove one of the most remarkable figures of early Russian history. A woman of fierce intelligence and even fiercer vengeance, Olga's retaliation against the Drevlians became legendary for its elaborate cruelty. When Drevlian ambassadors arrived to propose that she marry their prince, she had them buried alive in a trench. She lured another delegation into a bathhouse and burned them to death. She demanded tribute from the Drevlians in the form of birds, then tied burning materials to the birds and released them to return to their homes, setting the entire Drevlian capital ablaze. These stories may contain exaggeration, but they convey the ruthlessness that survival required in the world of early medieval politics. A woman ruling alone in that violent age needed to establish quickly and decisively that she was not to be trifled with. Beyond her talents for vengeance, Olga demonstrated remarkable political acumen. She reorganized the tribute system to prevent the kind of extortionate demands that had led to her husband's death, establishing fixed payments and regular collection points. She traveled to Constantinople and was baptized as a Christian, becoming the first Rus ruler to embrace the faith that would eventually define Russian civilization. Though she could not persuade her son Yaroslav to follow her into Christianity, she raised her grandson Vladimir in an environment where the new religion was known and respected. Her diplomatic visit to the Byzantine capital also enhanced Kiev's prestige, demonstrating that the Rus princes were recognized as legitimate rulers worthy of imperial attention. The reigns of these early princes established Kiev as something more than a trading post or military stronghold. The city became the center of a political system that bound together diverse Slavic tribes under a single ruling dynasty. Tribute flowed from the forests to the capital, while protection, justice, and access to wider trade networks flowed outward from the prince's seat. The Varangian elite intermarried with Slavic nobility, learned Slavic languages, and gradually became indistinguishable from the population they governed. The Rus were becoming Russians, though many generations would pass before that transformation was complete. The city itself grew as its importance increased. Wooden fortifications expanded to enclose larger areas. Churches began to appear, modest structures at first, serving the Christian community that had grown up around converts and Byzantine merchants. The prince's court attracted warriors, administrators, merchants, and craftsmen, creating an urban population dependent on the political and economic functions centered there. Markets bustled with goods from distant lands, while the rhythms of court life established patterns of ceremony and governance that gave form to the emerging state. Yet much remained unsettled as the first century of Rus rule drew toward its close. The ruling dynasty had established control, but the religious and cultural character of the realm remained undefined. The bulk of the population still worshipped the old gods, still followed customs inherited from their pagan ancestors. The question of what faith would shape the future of the Rus lands remained open, waiting for a prince strong enough and visionary enough to provide an answer. That prince would be Vladimir, grandson of Olga, son of Sviatoslav, and the man who would transform Kiev from a powerful city into the spiritual heart of a Christian civilization. His decision would echo through 1,000 years of history, but that story awaited its proper moment to unfold. Vladimir came to power through bloodshed, as was the custom of his age. The death of his father, Sviatoslav, had left 3 sons competing for dominance, and the struggle between them was resolved only when Vladimir defeated and killed his brother Yaropolk, seizing Kiev in the supreme position among the Rus princes. He was a man of enormous appetites and fierce ambitions, a warrior who had proven himself in battle, and a ruler who understood that power required constant demonstration. In the early years of his reign, he threw himself into the worship of the old gods with spectacular enthusiasm, as if to establish beyond doubt that he was a true son of the Slavic land and its ancient traditions. The paganism of the Rus was not a single unified religion, but rather a collection of cults, spirits, and practices that varied from tribe to tribe and region to region. Certain deities commanded widespread veneration, their names appearing across the Slavic world in various forms. Perun, the thunder god, held the highest position, a sky deity associated with storms, war, and the authority of princes. Pholos, or Veils, presided over cattle, commerce, and the underworld, representing the chthonic powers that balanced Perun's celestial dominion. Other gods governed the sun, the winds, fertility, and the countless aspects of existence that required divine attention and propitiation. Vladimir constructed a grand sanctuary on a hill near his palace in Kiev, erecting wooden idols of the principal deities in a display of pious munificence. The chronicle describes these images in some detail, noting that Perun's idol had a head of silver and a mustache of gold. Around this central figure stood representations of other gods, creating a pantheon made visible in carved and decorated wood. Priests tended these images, performing rituals, accepting offerings, and interpreting the will of the divine for those who came seeking guidance. The hilltop shrine became a center of religious life for the city, a place where the old ways received official sanction and support. The worship conducted at this sanctuary included practices that later Christian chroniclers found abhorrent. Animal sacrifice was common, with the blood and flesh of horses, cattle, and other creatures offered to appease or honor the gods. Human sacrifice, though perhaps less frequent, also occurred on certain occasions. The chronicle records that in 983, after a successful military campaign, the Kievans sought to offer a human victim to the gods in thanksgiving. The lot fell upon a young man who happened to be the son of a Christian Varangian. And when the father refused to surrender his child, both were killed by the angry mob. These Christian martyrs would later be honored as saints, their deaths remembered as testimony to the faith that would soon triumph over the old religion. Yet even as Vladimir promoted traditional worship with such vigor, forces were already at work that would lead him toward a radically different path. The Rus state existed within a world of competing faiths, surrounded by peoples who had embraced the great monotheistic religions that claimed universal truth. To the south lay the Byzantine Empire, Christian for centuries and radiating cultural influence throughout the region. To the east stretched the Islamic world, its civilization wealthy and sophisticated, its merchants regular visitors to Kiev's markets. To the west, the kingdoms of Poland and Hungary had recently accepted Christianity from Rome, joining the Latin Church that looked to the Pope for spiritual authority. The chronicle presents Vladimir's eventual conversion as a result of a deliberate investigation into the major religions of his time. Ambassadors supposedly arrived from various faiths to present their cases, while Vladimir sent his own envoys to observe how each religion was practiced in its homeland. The Muslim Bulgars of the Volga offered their faith, but Vladimir rejected Islam because of its prohibition of alcohol, reportedly declaring that drinking was the joy of the Rus, and they could not exist without it. Jewish Khazars presented their religion, but Vladimir dismissed them upon learning that God had scattered them from their homeland, asking why he should embrace a faith whose followers had been punished with exile. German missionaries offered Latin Christianity, but their presentations apparently failed to impress. The Byzantine envoys, however, made a profound impact when Vladimir's own ambassadors returned from Constantinople. They described their experience of worship in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia in terms of overwhelming wonder. They reported that they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth, for they had never witnessed such beauty, and they were certain that God dwelt there among the people. The aesthetic dimension of Orthodox Christianity, its magnificent liturgy, its visual splendor, its engagement of all the senses in the act of worship, spoke to something deep in the Rus character. Beauty became a vehicle of truth, and the beauty of Byzantine worship conquered hearts that might have resisted theological argument. Whether this account of religious comparison reflects actual historical events or represents a literary device employed by later chroniclers remains uncertain. What seems clear is that multiple factors contributed to Vladimir's decision to embrace Byzantine Christianity. Its political considerations played an important role. Its alliance with the Byzantine Empire offered advantages that no other relationship could match. Economic interests pointed in the same direction. Kane's sense trade with Constantinople was essential to Kiev's prosperity. Cultural prestige attached to association with the most sophisticated civilization in the Christian world. And personal factors, including the influence of Vladimir's Christian grandmother, Olga, had prepared the ground for conversion long before the final decision was made. The immediate catalyst came through military and diplomatic channels. The Byzantine Emperor Basil II faced a serious rebellion and desperately needed military assistance. He turned to Vladimir for help, and the Rus prince agreed to provide troops in exchange for an extraordinary prize, the hand of Anna, the emperor's sister, in marriage. Such a union had no precedent, for Byzantine princesses were not given to barbarian rulers, had the imperial family had consistently rejected similar requests from Western kings and emperors. Yet Basil's need was great enough to overcome traditional reluctance, and the agreement was struck with the condition that Vladimir accept baptism before the wedding could take place. Vladimir fulfilled his part of the bargain, sending 6,000 warriors to Constantinople, where they helped crush the rebellion and, subsequently, formed the nucleus of the famous Varangian Guard. But when the time came for Basil to deliver his sister, the emperor hesitated, reluctant to surrender a princess of the blood to a recently converted barbarian. Vladimir responded with force, besieging and capturing the Byzantine city of Cherson in Crimea, demonstrating that he had the power to take by war what was owed him by treaty. Faced with this pressure, the Byzantines relented. Anna traveled to Cherson, and there she was wed to Vladimir, who had been baptized and received the Christian name Basil in honor of his imperial brother-in-law. The prince, who returned to Kiev, was a transformed man, or at least a man committed to transforming his realm. He brought with him not only his Byzantine bride, but also priests, icons, relics, and church vessels. He brought craftsmen skilled in the construction of churches and the creation of religious art. He brought books in the Slavic language. 4 Byzantine missionaries had earlier developed an alphabet for the Slavs and translated essential Christian texts into their tongue. All of these resources were deployed in a systematic campaign to convert the Rus lands from paganism to Christianity, a campaign that would unfold over generations, but began with dramatic gestures in the capital city. The old sanctuary on the hill was destroyed, its idols cast down and subjected to deliberate humiliation. The image of Perun, that silver-headed deity who had so recently received worship and sacrifice, was tied to a horse's tail and dragged through the streets while men beat it with sticks. It was then thrown into the Dnieper, and guards were posted along the banks to prevent anyone from pulling it out until it had floated beyond the rapids and out of the territory of Kiev. This ritualized destruction served to demonstrate that the old gods were powerless, unable to defend even their own images against violation. If Perun could not save himself, how could he save those who worshipped him? The conversion of the common people followed with startling speed. Vladimir issued a proclamation commanding all residents of Kiev to appear at the river for baptism, declaring that anyone who failed to attend would be considered an enemy of the prince. On the appointed day, crowds gathered at the Dnieper, men and women and children, nobles and commoners alike. They entered the water together, standing waist-deep or neck-deep, while Byzantine priests performed the rites of baptism over them. The entire population of the capital was Christianized in a single collective ceremony, a mass conversion unprecedented in scale and symbolic power. The chronicle portrays this event as one of joy and willing acceptance, describing how the people entered the water gladly, understanding that their prince would not have commanded something harmful. Modern readers might suspect that the reality was more complicated, that many entered the river out of fear rather than faith, and that old beliefs persisted beneath the surface of official Christianity for generations afterward. Yet, the symbolic significance of the event remained profound, regardless of the inner dispositions of individual participants. Kiev had been claimed for Christ, its people marked with the sign of the cross, its future bound to the civilization of Byzantium. Vladimir immediately began the construction of churches to serve the newly Christian population. The first and most important was the Church of the Tithes, known in Slavic as the Desyatina Church, so named because Vladimir dedicated 1/10 of his revenues to its support. Byzantine architects and craftsmen were brought in to design and build this structure, creating a stone church decorated with mosaics and frescoes in the Byzantine style. The bones of Olga, Vladimir's grandmother and the first Christian ruler of the Rus, were transferred to this church, honoring her memory and linking the present conversion to earlier seeds of faith. The transformation extended far beyond the construction of buildings. Schools were established to train a native clergy, teaching, reading, and writing along with the doctrines and rituals of the faith. The Slavic translations made by earlier missionaries allowed Christianity to be taught and practiced in the language of the people rather than in Greek or Latin. This linguistic accessibility would prove enormously important for the spread and deep rooting of the faith among the Slavic populations. The Church also introduced new concepts of law, morality, and social organization, gradually reshaping the customs and values of Rus society according to Christian principles. Vladimir himself became a changed man in the years following his conversion, at least according to hagiographic tradition. The fierce warrior who had taken multiple wives and countless concubines now dismissed his former partners and lived with Anna alone. The ruler, who had once presided over human sacrifices, now showed mercy to criminals, hesitating to impose capital punishment, even when his bishops urged him to do so. The prince, who had seized power through fratricide, now worked to establish his legitimacy through piety and charity, feeding the poor and caring for the sick in demonstrations of Christian virtue. The conversion of 988 did not immediately transform Kiev into a thoroughly Christian city. Old beliefs and practices persisted in the villages and forests, mixing with Christian elements to create the distinctive synthesis that would characterize Russian popular religion for centuries. But the fundamental orientation had shifted. Kiev now looked to Constantinople not only for trade goods and political alliances, but for spiritual guidance and cultural models. The path was set that would lead to golden domes, icon-filled churches, monastic communities, and the rich tradition of Orthodox Christianity that would become inseparable from Russian identity itself. Vladimir's death in 1015 unleashed another round of fratricidal conflict among his sons, a bloody struggle that would claim several lives before a single prince emerged victorious. The old prince had fathered numerous children by his various wives and concubines, and he had distributed territories among them in a system that invited competition rather than cooperation. When the restraining hand of the father was removed, the brothers turned upon one another with savage determination. Two of Vladimir's sons, Boris and Gleb, were murdered by agents of their brother, Sviatopolk, who sought to eliminate rivals before they could challenge his claim to Kiev. These innocent victims, killed without resistance or retaliation, would later be canonized as the first saints of the Russian Church. Their passive acceptance of death, interpreted as Christ-like martyrdom, Sviatopolk's crimes earned him the epithet the accursed in the chronicles, and his reign proved brief. Another brother, Yaroslav, who ruled in Novgorod, raised an army and marched against the fratricidal usurper. The struggle between them lasted several years and drew in foreign allies on both sides, Sviatopolk receiving support from his father-in-law, the Polish king Bolesław the Brave. At one point, Polish forces actually captured Kiev and installed Sviatopolk on the throne, but they could not hold the city against Yaroslav's determined opposition. The final battle came in 1019 along the banks of the Alta River, near the very spot where Boris had been murdered years before. Yaroslav's forces crushed Sviatopolk's army, and the accursed prince fled westward, dying in exile somewhere between Poland and Bohemia, tormented, according to legend, by demons and madness. Yaroslav's victory did not immediately bring peace, for another brother named Mstislav still ruled in the distant city of Tmutarakan on the shores of the Black Sea. This Mstislav was a formidable warrior, famous for having killed a Kasodian chieftain in single combat, and he commanded forces sufficient to challenge Yaroslav's supremacy. The two brothers fought a major battle in 1024, and Yaroslav suffered a serious defeat. Yet, rather than press his advantage toward total victory, Mstislav proposed a division of the realm. The brothers agreed to share the Rus lands, with the Dnieper serving as the boundary between their domains. Yaroslav held Kiev and the territories to the west, while Mstislav ruled the eastern regions from his seat at Chernigov. This arrangement persisted until Mstislav's death in 1036, after which Yaroslav finally united the entire realm under his sole authority. The prince who now ruled without rivals would earn the title by which history remembers him, Yaroslav the Wise. His reign, spanning from his final consolidation of power in 1036 until his death in 1054, represented the golden age of Kievan Rus, a period of unprecedented prosperity, cultural achievement, and international prestige. Under his leadership, Kiev transformed from a prosperous trading city into one of the great capitals of medieval Christendom, a center of learning, art, and political power that could claim equality with the most celebrated cities of Europe. The wooden town of earlier generations gave way to a city of stone, adorned with monuments that proclaimed the wealth and sophistication of its rulers. The greatest of these monuments was the Cathedral of St. Sophia, constructed during the 1040s as the spiritual heart of the realm. Yaroslav chose the same name that the Byzantines had given to their most sacred church in Constantinople, its great Hagia Sophia, whose beauty had reportedly convinced Vladimir's envoys to embrace Orthodox Christianity. This was no coincidence, but rather a deliberate statement of aspiration and achievement. Kiev's St. Sophia would demonstrate that the Rus had not merely received Christianity from Byzantium, but had made it their own, creating a civilization worthy of comparison with their spiritual mentors. The cathedral rose on a scale unprecedented in Rus architecture, its 13 domes symbolizing Christ and the 12 apostles, its walls of brick and stone, replacing the wooden construction that had characterized earlier churches. Byzantine master craftsmen directed the work, but local artisans learned their techniques and contributed their own skills to the project. The interior glittered with mosaics and frescoes, depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, saints, and angels in the solemn, hieratic style of Orthodox iconography. Gold leaf caught the candlelight during services, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly splendor that lifted worshippers out of their ordinary existence and into the presence of the divine. Among the mosaics that adorned St. Sophia, one image held particular significance: the great figure of the Virgin Mary with arms raised in prayer, positioned in the apse where she presided over every liturgy celebrated in the cathedral. This image, known as the Oranta, or the unbreakable wall, became a symbol of Kiev itself, a divine protectress watching over the city and its people. Pilgrims traveled great distances to pray before her image, and the belief developed that as long as the Oranta stood, Kiev would never fall to its enemies. The cathedral thus became more than a place of worship. It became a sacred anchor of identity, binding the city to heaven through the intercession of the Mother of God. Yaroslav did not limit his building program to religious structures. He constructed a massive expansion of the city's fortifications, closing a much larger area than the walls of Vladimir's time had protected. The new defenses included the famous Golden Gate, a monumental entrance that combined military functionality with symbolic grandeur. Like St. Sophia, the Golden Gate took its name from a famous structure in Constantinople, the ceremonial entrance through which Byzantine emperors processed during major celebrations. Yaroslav's gate featured a church dedicated to the Annunciation built above its archway, so that visitors entering Kiev would pass beneath an image of the moment when the angel Gabriel announced to Mary she would bear the Son of God. The prince's ambitions extended far beyond construction projects. He established the first comprehensive legal code for the Rus lands, a collection of laws known as the Russkaya Pravda, or Russian justice. This code addressed crimes, punishments, property rights, and procedures for resolving disputes, attempting to replace blood feuds and private vengeance with systematic judicial processes. The laws reflected the social structure of Kievan society, with different penalties applying to different classes of people, from princes and boyards at the top through free commoners to the various categories of slaves and servants at the bottom. Though far from egalitarian by modern standards, the Russkaya Pravda represented an important step toward the rule of law. in the regularization of social relations. Education flourished under Yaroslav's patronage. He gathered scribes and scholars, establishing schools where young men could learn to read and write. The prince himself was reportedly an avid reader who spent his nights poring over books, building a library that became famous throughout the Christian world. Translation projects rendered Greek texts into Slavonic, making the theological, historical, and literary treasures of Byzantium accessible to readers who knew no Greek. Chronicles began to be compiled, quoting the history of the Rus from their legendary origins through contemporary events. The written word, which had arrived with Christianity, now became a tool for cultural development and historical memory. Monasticism took root and grew during this period, as men and women seeking lives of prayer and asceticism withdrew from the world into religious communities. The most famous of these foundations was the monastery of the caves, known as the Petrsk Lavra, established in the hills south of Kiev. Monks excavated chambers in the soft earth, creating underground cells where they could live, pray, and eventually be buried. The monastery became a center of spiritual life, producing saints whose relics attracted pilgrims and whose teachings shaped the development of Russian Orthodoxy. The influence of these monastic communities extended far beyond their immediate members, providing models of holiness and centers of learning that enriched the entire society. Yaroslav understood that marriages were instruments of diplomacy, and he deployed his children accordingly. His daughters wed the kings of France, Hungary, and Norway, while his sons married princesses from Byzantium, Poland, and the Holy Roman Empire. These unions wove Kiev into the fabric of European royalty, creating networks of alliance and mutual recognition that elevated the status of the Rus dynasty. When Yaroslav's daughter Anna became Queen of France, she brought Slavic literacy to the French court, reportedly signing documents with her own name, while her husband, King Henry I, could manage only a cross. The princess from Kiev was more educated than the king of what would become one of Europe's most powerful nations. The connections forged through these marriages reflected Kiev's position as a major center of medieval civilization. Visitors from distant lands traveled to the city, marveling at its churches, its markets, and its evident prosperity. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler of the 11th century, described Kiev as a rival to Constantinople itself, the ornament of Greece. This was exaggeration born of limited information, but it captured something true about the city's reputation. Kiev had become a place that mattered on the European stage, a capital whose princes corresponded with popes and emperors, whose churches housed relics that pilgrims traveled far to venerate, whose merchants traded goods from Scandinavia to Persia. The prosperity of the Golden Age rested on foundations both commercial and agricultural. Trade along the Dnieper route continued to bring wealth into the city, though the patterns had shifted somewhat from earlier centuries. The slave trade, which had been so important to the first Varangian merchants, diminished as Christianity discouraged the enslavement of fellow believers. Furs, wax, and honey remained valuable exports, while Byzantine luxury goods, including silk, jewelry, and fine metalwork, flowed northward to satisfy the tastes of the Rus elite. The surrounding countryside produced grain, which fed the growing urban population and could be exported during years of abundance. Yaroslav ruled as the undisputed master of a vast realm, but he recognized that his death would create the same succession crisis that had followed his father's passing. In an attempt to prevent fratricidal warfare among his sons, he established a system of succession based on seniority within the dynasty rather than direct inheritance from father to son. The eldest surviving member of the family would hold Kiev in the supreme position, while younger brothers and nephews would rule lesser cities in a hierarchy of prestige. As seniors died, juniors would move up the ladder, eventually reaching Kiev if they lived long enough. This system, known as the rota or ladder system, was meant to give every prince hope of eventual advancement while preventing any single branch of the family from monopolizing power. When Yaroslav died in 1054, his body was laid to rest in a marble sarcophagus within St. Sophia Cathedral, surrounded by the mosaics and frescoes he had commissioned. His reign had established Kiev as the mother of Russian cities in cultural and spiritual terms, as well as political ones. The institutions he created, the churches he built, the laws he codified, and the traditions he fostered would shape the development of the Rus lands for generations to come. Yet, even as mourners gathered to honor the departed prince, the seeds of future conflict were already present in the succession arrangements he had devised. The system meant to prevent civil war would instead guarantee it. His brothers and cousins competed for position in an increasingly complex and fractious political landscape. The system Yaroslav, designed to ensure a peaceful succession, contained within itself the mechanisms of its own failure. By establishing that the throne of Kiev should pass not from father to son, but from brother to brother, and then to the next generation, he created a structure in which every prince had theoretical claim to eventual supremacy. This meant that every prince also had reason to resent those who stood ahead of him in the line of succession, and every prince had incentive to form alliances against rivals who might otherwise reach Kiev before him. The ladder of succession became a ladder of conflict, each rung contested by ambitious men unwilling to wait patiently for their turn. The first generation after Yaroslav maintained a fragile peace, largely because the three surviving sons who mattered most managed to cooperate despite their differences. Iziaslav held Kiev as the eldest, while Sviatoslav ruled Chernigov and Vizhov. These three brothers formed a triumvirate that dominated Rus politics for 2 decades, collectively defending the realm against external threats and suppressing challenges from younger relatives. They convened councils to address common problems, coordinated military campaigns against steppe nomads, and generally upheld the fiction of fraternal harmony that their father had envisioned. Yet even this generation could not entirely avoid conflict. In 1068, a devastating defeat at the hands of the Cumans, the Turkic nomads who had replaced the earlier Pechenegs as the primary threat from the steppes, triggered a popular uprising in Kiev. The citizens demanded weapons to defend themselves, and when Iziaslav refused, they drove him from the city and installed a different prince in his place. Iziaslav eventually recovered his throne with Polish assistance, but the episode revealed the fragility of princely authority. The people of Kiev had demonstrated that they possessed agency of their own, that they could make and unmake rulers when pushed to extremity. This popular dimension of politics would resurface repeatedly in the city's history. The balance among Yaroslav's sons collapsed entirely after Sviatoslav from Kiev in 1073. He, seizing the supreme position for himself in violation of the succession principles their father had established. When Sviatoslav died 3 years later, Iziaslav returned yet again, only to fall in battle in 1078 while fighting against nephews who contested his authority. Vesavlad, the last of the 3 original brothers, finally achieved sole supremacy and ruled until 1093. But by then, the precedents of usurpation and violent competition had been thoroughly established. The next generation would carry these patterns forward with even greater intensity. The princes who followed multiplied the conflicts by multiplying themselves. Yaroslav's grandsons and great-grandsons proliferated across the Rus lands, each ruling some territory and each nursing ambitions for greater power. The system that was supposed to rotate princes through a hierarchy of cities became hopelessly tangled as different branches of the family refused to accept their designated positions. Some princes held onto cities that they should have surrendered when their seniors died. Others seized territories to which they had no legitimate claim. The law of the dynasty gave way to the law of military strength, and Kiev became a prize fought over by whoever could assemble the largest army or forge the most advantageous alliance. A council of princes convened at Lyubich in 1097, attempting to restore order by establishing a new principle. Each branch of the family would hold its patrimony permanently, ending the rotation that had caused so much strife. This principle of patrimonial inheritance might have brought stability if it had been consistently applied, but violations began almost immediately. One prince was blinded by rivals shortly after the council ended, demonstrating that agreements meant little when ambition and opportunity aligned. The endless cycle of wars, truces, betrayals, and renewed wars continued with barely a pause, draining the resources of the realm and weakening its capacity to resist external threats. Vladimir Monomakh, who became Grand Prince of Kiev in 1113, represented a temporary revival of strong central authority. He was a grandson of Yaroslav the Wise through his father, and a grandson of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Monomachos through his mother, from whom he took his distinctive epithet. A skilled warrior and capable administrator, Monomakh had spent decades fighting humans and managing the complex politics of princely competition before finally ascending to Kiev's throne. His reign brought a measure of peace and order, and his literary works, including an autobiography and a testament addressed to his children, reveal a thoughtful ruler deeply concerned with questions of justice, duty, and the proper conduct of princes. Monomakh's son, Mstislav, continued his father's policies after succeeding to Kiev in 1125, maintaining the prestige of the capital and the authority of its ruler. But Mstislav died in 1132, and with him perished the last hope of holding the Rus lands together under effective central leadership. His successors lacked his abilities and his legitimacy, while the centrifugal forces pulling the realm apart had grown too strong for any single prince to contain. The decades following Mstislav's death witnessed the final fragmentation of Kievan Rus into a collection of effectively independent principalities, each pursuing its own interests with little regard for the theoretical supremacy of whoever happened to hold Kiev. The city itself became a battleground, changing hands repeatedly as different princes and factions fought for control. Between 1146 and 1154, Kiev was captured, lost, and recaptured numerous times, its fortifications damaged, its population exhausted by the endless demands of competing armies. Princes who seized the city often found themselves unable to hold it, driven out by rivals before they could consolidate their position. The throne that Yaroslav the Wise had made glorious became a curse, its occupants perpetually insecure, its authority perpetually contested. To hold Kiev was to paint a target on oneself, inviting attack from every direction. The symbolic death blow came in 1169, delivered not by foreign invaders, but by a Russian prince who should have coveted Kiev rather than destroyed it. Andrei Bogolyubusky was the ruler of Vladimir Suzdal, a principality in the northeastern forests that had grown wealthy and powerful while the older centers of Rus civilization tore themselves apart. Andrei descended from Monomakh and therefore had legitimate claim to Kiev, but his ambitions pointed in a different direction. Rather than take Kiev for himself and rule from the traditional capital, he sent his armies to sack the city with a brutality previously reserved for foreign enemies. The assault of 1169 lasted 3 days, during which Andrei's forces systematically plundered Kiev's churches, monasteries, and homes. Icons were stripped from their settings, precious metalwork was melted down or carried away. Manuscripts accumulated over generations were destroyed or scattered. The soldiers showed no respect for the sacred spaces that had made Kiev the spiritual heart of the Rus lands, treating the mother of Russian cities as conquered foreign territory rather than the patrimony of their own people. Churches that Vladimir and Yaroslav had built with such care were violated by men who claimed descent from those same rulers. What made this destruction particularly significant was what followed, or rather, what did not follow. Andrei Bogolyubusky had no interest in moving to Kiev and ruling from there. He installed a subordinate as prince of the ruined city and returned to his own capital at Vladimir, demonstrating that Kiev no longer held the importance it had once possessed. The political center of gravity had shifted northward to the forested regions where new cities were rising and new powers were forming. Kiev remained symbolically important, still honored as the mother of Russian cities and the seat of the metropolitan bishop, but its days as the actual center of political power had ended. The reasons for this shift were multiple and complex. The northeastern principalities enjoyed certain advantages that Kiev lacked. Their forests provided protection against the steppe nomads who constantly threatened the exposed southern territories. Their rivers connected them to trade routes leading toward the Baltic and the emerging commercial centers of northern Europe. Their populations grew as refugees fled the violence and instability of the southern regions, bringing skills and labor to developing towns. The very marginality that had once made the Northeast a backwater now became an asset, allowing it to develop while the traditional centers exhausted themselves in internecine conflict. Kiev's economic position had also deteriorated over the course of the 12th century. The great trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks, which had been the foundation of the city's prosperity, carried less traffic than it once had. The Crusades had opened new commercial connections between Western Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, bypassing the Dnieper corridor entirely. Italian merchants from Venice and Genoa now dominated the trade that had once enriched Byzantine and Rus intermediaries. The furs and other northern products that Kiev had channeled southward found new routes to market, while the Byzantine luxury goods that had flowed northward became available through alternative sources. The Cuman threat added constant pressure to the struggling city. These Turkic nomads controlled the steppes south of Kiev, raiding agricultural settlements, disrupting trade, and extracting tribute from princes too weak to resist them. Some Rus princes formed alliances with Cuman leaders, even marrying Cuman princesses. But these arrangements merely drew the nomads deeper into Rus political conflicts. Cuman warriors fought on both sides of civil wars, their presence a reminder that the princes could not defend their lands without outside assistance. The frontier that Kiev had once dominated now dominated Kiev, its dangers ever present and its pressures unrelenting. The city that had been the peer of Constantinople and Paris became a shadow of its former glory. Its population declined as people fled to safer regions or perished in the endless conflicts. Its buildings fell into disrepair. The resources for maintenance consumed by military necessities were simply unavailable. The monasteries and churches still functioned, still provided spiritual services to those who remained. The atmosphere of cultural confidence and creative energy that had characterized the Golden Age was gone. Scribes still copied manuscripts and chroniclers still recorded events, but they did so in a tone of lament, mourning a greatness that had passed. The princes who held Kiev in the later 12th and early 13th centuries were minor figures, men whose names appear in chronicles without leaving much impression. They came and went with bewildering frequency, some ruling for years and some for mere months. The throne that Yaroslav had adorned with prestige and power became a revolving door through which forgettable rulers passed on their way to obscurity. The city endured because cities have their own momentum, because populations persist and economies continue functioning even in diminished circumstances. But the Kiev that endured was a diminished thing, a relic of former greatness rather than a center of present power. Even in its reduced state, Kiev retained importance as a symbol and as a sacred geography. The Cathedral of St. Sophia still stood, its mosaics still glittered, its services still drew worshippers seeking connection to the divine. The monastery of the caves still housed monks whose prayers were believed to benefit all the Rus lands. The very name of Kiev still evoked memories of unity and achievement. A golden age to which later generations would look back with nostalgia and longing. The mother of Russian cities could not be entirely forgotten, even by those who had abandoned her, could not be reduced to just another provincial town, no matter how far her political fortunes had fallen. This diminished but still significant city awaited the catastrophe that would reduce even its residual importance to ashes. Far to the east, beyond the steppes where the Cumans roamed, a new power was rising, a force that would sweep across continents and reshape the entire political landscape of Eurasia. The Mongols were coming, and nothing in their path would survive unchanged. The warnings came from the east, carried by refugees and traders who spoke of horrors beyond comprehension. A people called the Mongols had emerged from the depths of Asia, united under a leader whose very name inspired terror. Genghis Khan had forged the scattered tribes of the steppe into a military force unlike anything the world had seen. An army of mounted warriors whose tactics combined ferocity with sophisticated coordination. They had already conquered vast territories, destroying empires that had stood for centuries, leaving pyramids of skulls to mark their passage. Now their attention was turning westward, toward the lands of the Rus and the kingdoms beyond. The first encounter between the Mongols and the Rus princes came in 1223 at a place called the Kalka River, near the Sea of Azov. A Mongol reconnaissance force had pursued the Cumans, those Turkic nomads who had long troubled the southern frontiers of Rus territory. The Cuman Khan appealed to his Rus neighbors for assistance, warning that if the Mongols destroyed the Cumans today, they would destroy the Rus tomorrow. Several princes responded to this call, assembling a substantial army and marching south to meet the invaders. They had no idea what awaited them. The Battle of the Kalka River ended in catastrophic defeat for the combined Rus and Cuman forces. The Mongol commanders employed tactics that bewildered their opponents, feigning retreat to draw the enemy into pursuit, then turning suddenly to attack from multiple directions at once. The Rus princes, who had failed to coordinate their actions effectively, were destroyed piecemeal. Some died in the fighting, while others were captured and subjected to a particularly grim fate. The Mongols laid wooden boards over the bodies of their noble captives and held a victory feast upon this platform, slowly crushing the princes to death beneath the weight of the celebration. This was not mere cruelty, but a calculated demonstration of what awaited those who resisted Mongol power. Yet, after this devastating victory, the Mongol force simply withdrew, disappearing back into the eastern steppes as mysteriously as it had appeared. The reconnaissance mission had accomplished its purpose, gathering information about the lands and peoples to the west. The main Mongol armies were occupied elsewhere, consolidating conquests in Central Asia and China, and the full-scale invasion of the western lands would have to wait. The Rus princes, those who had survived the disaster at the Kalka, returned to their internecine conflicts, as if the Mongol threat had been a passing storm rather than a harbinger of annihilation. 15 years passed before the storm returned, this time with force sufficient to overwhelm everything in its path. Genghis Khan had died in 1227, but his empire continued to expand under his successors. The task of conquering the western lands fell to Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, who commanded an army estimated at anywhere from 30,000 to 150,000 warriors. These numbers may seem modest compared to later European armies, but the Mongol forces possessed advantages that made them far more formidable than their numbers alone would suggest. The Mongol military system had been perfected through generations of warfare on the Asian steppes. Every male was trained from childhood to ride and shoot, creating a population of warriors rather than an army drawn from a civilian population. Their composite bows could be fired accurately from horseback at full gallop, giving them firepower that no European force could match. Their tactics emphasized mobility, coordination, and psychological warfare, using terror as deliberately as they used arrows. They traveled with multiple horses per warrior, allowing them to cover vast distances at speeds that seemed supernatural to their opponents. They had learned siege warfare from Chinese engineers, enabling them to reduce fortified cities that might otherwise have held out against purely nomadic forces. The invasion began in earnest in 1237, when Mongol armies crossed the Volga, and descended upon the northeastern Rus principalities. The city of Ryazan fell first, its population massacred after a siege of just 5 days. Vladimir followed, the Grand Prince and his family perishing when the cathedral in which they had taken refuge was set ablaze. City after city met the same fate, their defenders overwhelmed, their populations killed or enslaved, their buildings burned to the ground. The Mongols moved through the winter when European armies typically suspended operations, using the frozen rivers as highways that carried them deep into enemy territory. Kiev watched these distant disasters with growing dread, but could do little to prepare for what was coming. The city was no longer the dominant power it had been in Yaroslav's day, no longer capable of commanding the resources needed to mount an effective defense. The princes who ruled it came and went with bewildering frequency, their authority contested and their resources limited. The fortifications that had been impressive in earlier centuries were now inadequate against an enemy that had learned to breach the walls of cities far stronger than Kiev. The population could pray for deliverance, could hope that the Mongols would turn aside or that some miracle would intervene, but realistic hope was difficult to sustain. The Mongol advance paused in 1238 as the spring thaw transformed the landscape into impassable mud, forcing the invaders to withdraw to the steppes to rest and regroup. This respite lasted longer than anyone had expected, as internal Mongol politics and campaigns in other regions delayed the resumption of the western offensive. Some in the Rus lands may have dared to hope that the worst had passed, that the Mongols would be content with what they had already conquered. But Bata Khan had not forgotten the lands that remained unconquered, and in 1240 he turned his attention to the south, to the ancient capital that still bore the title of Mother of Russian Cities. The Mongol army that appeared before Kiev in late 1240 was the largest military force the city had ever faced. Contemporary accounts, though prone to exaggeration, describe an army so vast that its horses' hooves raised a thunder that could be heard for miles. It's an army whose tents covered the landscape as far as the eye could see. Batu Khan sent envoys to demand surrender, offering terms that would spare the city if it submitted peacefully. The ruling prince, a figure named Mikhail, who had recently fled from the Mongol advance further east, chose to flee again rather than face the invaders. The city was left in the hands of a military commander named Dnieper, who rejected the Mongol demands and prepared to resist. The siege began in early December as Mongol forces completely encircled the city and began systematic bombardment of its walls. They had brought siege engines capable of hurling stones with devastating force, machines that pounded the fortifications day and night without pause. The defenders fought back with desperate courage, knowing that surrender offered no real hope of survival given what had happened to other cities that had resisted. Women and children joined in the defense, carrying supplies to the walls and helping to repair damage as quickly as it was inflicted. The churches rang their bells continuously, whether in defiance or in prayer, or simply because the sound provided some comfort amid the terror. The walls of Kiev had been built to resist the enemies of an earlier age, not the siege technology that the Mongols had mastered. Day by day, the bombardment took its toll, opening breaches that the defenders struggled to plug with whatever materials came to hand. The section near the Polish Gate, where the walls were weakest, became the focus of the Mongol assault. When this portion finally collapsed, waves of attackers poured through the gap, fighting their way into the city against resistance that continued even as the situation became obviously hopeless. The fall of Kiev unfolded over several days of street-by-street combat and systematic destruction. The defenders retreated to the Church of the Tides, the ancient Desiatina church that Vladimir had built to celebrate the conversion of the Rus. So many people crowded into this sanctuary that its galleries collapsed under their weight, killing many even before the Mongols broke through. Those who survived the collapse were slaughtered when the enemy finally entered. their blood staining the floors where generations of princes had been buried. The church itself was pulled down, its stones scattered, its treasures looted or destroyed. The Mongols did not merely conquer Kiev, but erased it as a functioning city. Its buildings were systematically burned, their inhabitants killed or dragged away into slavery. Churches that had stood for centuries were demolished, their bells melted down, their sacred objects profaned. The population that had numbered in the tens of thousands was reduced to a few hundred survivors hiding in the ruins. A papal envoy who passed through the region several years later described seeing countless skulls and bones scattered across the landscape, the unburied remains of those who had perished in the catastrophe. He reported that Kiev, once a great and populous city, now contained scarcely 200 houses, its surviving inhabitants living in conditions of utter subjection. The destruction of Kiev sent shockwaves throughout Christendom. If such an ancient and renowned city could be obliterated so completely, what hope did anyone else have against the Mongol onslaught? The invaders continued westward after Kiev's fall, defeating Polish and German armies at the Battle of Legnica and Hungarian forces at the Battle of Mohi in 1241. Europe seemed open before them, its kingdoms incapable of mounting effective resistance. Only the death of the great Khan Gadai, far away in Mongolia, halted the advance. Spatu Khan and other Mongol leaders withdrew eastward to participate in the succession deliberations. Western Europe was saved by a death in Asia, not by any military achievement of its own. The Mongols never returned to complete their conquest of the western lands, but they maintained their grip on the territories they had already taken. The Golden Horde, the western khanate of the Mongol Empire, established its capital at Sarai on the lower Volga and demanded submission from all the Rus principalities. Princes who wished to rule had to travel to Sarai and prostrate themselves before the Khan, receiving patents of authority that could be revoked at any moment. Tribute flowed eastward in staggering quantities, draining resources that might otherwise have supported recovery and development. Resistance was met with punitive expeditions that repeated on smaller scales the devastation of the original conquest. Kiev's position under Mongol rule was particularly marginal. The city had been so thoroughly destroyed that it held little economic or strategic value for the conquerors. It lay far from the horde's centers of power, too distant to warrant close supervision, but too weak to matter much in the calculations of Mongol politics. The metropolitan bishop, the head of the Orthodox Church in the Ruslands, had already relocated to Vladimir before the invasion and would eventually move to Moscow, taking with him the ecclesiastical prestige that had been one of Kiev's remaining claims to significance. The mother of Russian cities became an orphan, abandoned by the church and ignored by the powers that now determined the fate of the region. The centuries that followed the Mongol conquest represent the darkest period in Kiev's long history. The city that had been the peer of Constantinople and Paris became a depopulated ruin, struggling merely to survive. Recovery was agonizingly slow, measured in generations rather than years. The population crept back gradually as refugees returned and new settlers arrived, but the city they inhabited bore little resemblance to the Golden Age capital of Yaroslav the Wise. The great churches lay in ruins, the monasteries were emptied, the markets that had once drawn merchants from across the known world fell silent. Kiev endured because places endure, because people continued to live on those hills above the Dnieper, but it endured as a shadow of what it had been. The Mongol destruction marked a fundamental rupture in the history of the Ruslands, a dividing line between before and after that shaped everything that followed. The political unity that Kiev and Rus had represented, however imperfectly, was shattered beyond repair. Different regions would develop along different paths, eventually becoming the distinct nations of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. New centers of power would rise in the north and east, building their strength under Mongol overlordship, and eventually challenging the horde itself. Moscow would claim to be the true heir of Kiev's legacy, the gatherer of Russian lands and the defender of Orthodox civilization. But Kiev itself, the original mother of Russian cities, would remain under foreign domination for centuries to come. Passed from one empire to another without recovering the independence and glory it had once possessed. The century that followed the Mongol catastrophe left Kiev suspended between worlds. A ruined city, nominally subject to the Golden Horde, yet too diminished to attract much attention from its distant overlords. The Mongols had no interest in rebuilding what they had destroyed. They demanded tribute, enforced submission, occasionally dispatched punitive expeditions against those who defied their authority, but they did not attempt to administer the Rus lands directly. Local princes continued to rule their shattered domains, traveling to the Horde's capital at Sarai to receive patents of authority and to demonstrate their loyalty through elaborate rituals of obeisance. Kiev had such princes, but they governed a population measured in hundreds rather than thousands, ruling over ruins rather than a functioning city. The vacuum created by Mongol destruction and neglect invited new powers to expand into territories that had once belonged to Kiev and Rus. From the northwest came the Lithuanians, a Baltic people who had long lived in the forests between the Rus lands and the sea. Unlike most of their neighbors, the Lithuanians had resisted Christianization, maintaining their traditional paganism even as surrounding peoples embraced the cross. This religious distinctiveness had isolated them, but also unified them against external pressure. By the early 14th century, Lithuanian leaders had forged their scattered tribes into a formidable military power, one capable of challenging both the Teutonic Knights who threatened from the west and the weakened Rus. Principalities that lay to the south and east. Lithuanian expansion into former Rus territories proceeded gradually but steadily throughout the 14th century. The Grand Dukes of Lithuania, particularly Gediminas and his successors, pursued a policy of incorporation that combined military force with diplomatic flexibility. They did not seek to destroy the Rus principalities, but rather to absorb them, allowing local elites to retain their positions while acknowledging Lithuanian overlordship. Orthodox Christianity was tolerated and even favored in many contexts, as the Lithuanian rulers recognized that they were incorporating populations far more numerous than their own pagan Lithuanian subjects. The language of administration in the expanding Grand Duchy was not Lithuanian, but rather the Slavic chancery language that had developed from the literary traditions of Kievan Rus. The decisive moment for Kiev came with the Battle of Blue Waters in 1362, when Lithuanian forces under Grand Duke Algirdas defeated a Mongol army and claimed control over the lands surrounding the ancient city. This victory did not entirely end Mongol influence in the region, as the Golden Horde remained a factor in steppe politics for another century, but it transferred effective sovereignty over Kiev from Tatar to Lithuanian hands. The ruined city passed two new masters who, unlike the Mongols, had reasons to invest in its recovery. Kiev's position along trade routes and its symbolic importance as the mother of Russian cities made it valuable to rulers seeking to legitimize their authority over Orthodox Slavic populations. Under Lithuanian rule, Kiev began a slow process of recovery that would continue for generations. The population gradually increased as refugees returned and new settlers arrived, drawn by opportunities in a city that was rebuilding from devastation. Markets resumed their functions, craftsmen re-established their workshops, and churches that had stood empty began to hold services again. The scale remained modest compared to the Golden Age, but the direction was positive. Kiev was no longer a corpse, but a patient in convalescence, weak and dependent, but showing signs of returning vitality. The Lithuanian Grand Dukes governed their Rus territories through a system that preserved considerable local autonomy. Kiev received its own prince, typically a member of a Lithuanian ruling dynasty, but governing according to established Rus customs and laws. The Ruskaya Pravda, the legal code compiled under Yaroslav the Wise, continued to regulate disputes among the Orthodox population. Boyar families retained their estates and their influence, serving the new rulers much as they had served the old. Orthodox bishops maintained their ecclesiastical authority, their jurisdiction unchanged, despite the pagan or later Catholic faith of the Grand Dukes themselves. This relatively tolerant arrangement reflected practical necessities as much as ideological commitments. The Lithuanian rulers commanded a small, ethnic Lithuanian population that could not possibly administer the vast territories they had acquired. They needed the cooperation of local elites, needed the Orthodox Church to maintain social order, needed the continuity of existing institutions to make their rule viable. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania became in many ways a successor state to Kiev and Rus, preserving its language, its religion, and its cultural traditions under a new political framework. Some historians have argued that the Grand Duchy, rather than Muscovy, represented the true heir of Kiev's legacy, though this interpretation remains contested. The religious situation evolved over time, particularly after the Grand Duke Jagala accepted Catholic baptism in 1386 as part of his marriage to Jadwiga, the Queen of Poland. This union brought Lithuania into the orbit of Latin Christendom, creating a personal bond between the Lithuanian and Polish crowns that would eventually transform both realms. Jagila, now known by its Polish name Władysław Jagiello, remained Grand Duke of Lithuania while also becoming King of Poland, though he appointed a cousin to govern Lithuania directly. The implications for the Orthodox population of Lithuanian-ruled territories were not immediately clear, but the long-term trajectory pointed toward increasing Catholic influence and eventual pressure on those who maintained the Byzantine faith. Kiev and other Orthodox centers initially experienced little direct interference with their religious practices. The union of crowns did not immediately translate into religious uniformity, and the practical tolerance that had characterized earlier Lithuanian rule continued for several generations. But the balance of power was shifting. Catholic clergy arrived in increasing numbers, establishing churches and monasteries in territories that had been exclusively Orthodox. Polish nobles began to acquire estates in Lithuanian lands, bringing with them the cultural assumptions and religious loyalties of their homeland. The Orthodox population found itself increasingly surrounded by a Catholic elite that viewed their faith as schismatic at best and heretical at worst. The formal merger of Lithuania and Poland through the Union of Lublin in 1569 accelerated these pressures. This agreement transformed the personal union of crowns into a constitutional union of states, creating the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that would dominate Eastern European politics for the next 2 centuries. Kiev and the surrounding Ukrainian territories were transferred from Lithuanian to direct Polish administration, becoming the new voivodeship of Kiev within the Polish crown. This administrative change brought Orthodox communities under the authority of a state that was explicitly and officially Catholic, that looked to Rome for spiritual guidance, and that viewed religious uniformity as both a divine commandment and a political necessity. Polish rule brought significant changes to the social structure of the Kiev region. The Polish nobility, the Szlachta, enjoyed privileges and powers that exceeded what their equivalents in most other European states possessed. They elected their king, dominated the parliament called the Sejm, and exercised nearly absolute authority over the peasants who worked their lands. As Polish nobles acquired estates in the newly incorporated Ukrainian territories, they imported this system of noble privilege and peasant subjugation. The relatively free peasantry that had characterized the region under Lithuanian rule found themselves increasingly bound to the soil, their labor obligations growing heavier with each passing generation. The Orthodox Church faced mounting pressure to accept union with Rome, acknowledging the Pope's authority, while theoretically retaining Eastern liturgical practices. This project of religious union appealed to some Orthodox hierarchs who saw in it an opportunity to gain the social status and legal protections that Catholic clergy enjoyed. In 1596, the Union of Brest created the Enniat, or Greek Catholic Church. It's an institution that used Orthodox liturgy and married clergy while acknowledging papal supremacy. The union split the Orthodox community, with some bishops accepting the new arrangement and others fiercely rejecting it. Those who remained Orthodox found themselves increasingly marginalized. Their churches sometimes seized for any use. Their clergy denied the privileges accorded to their Catholic counterparts. The combination of religious pressure, economic exploitation, and social degradation created conditions ripe for resistance. That resistance found its most dramatic expression in the borderlands south of Kiev, where the steppe met the settled agricultural zone. This was the frontier, a dangerous and lawless region where neither Polish authority nor Tatar power could establish complete control. Here gathered men who had fled the increasingly oppressive conditions of the settled lands, escaped serfs and religious dissidents, adventurers and outlaws. They called themselves Cossacks, a term derived from a Turkic word meaning free men or adventurers, and they created a society unlike any other in Europe. The Cossack communities that formed along the Dnieper rapids combined military prowess with democratic self-governance. They elected their leaders, called atamans or hetmans, and made collective decisions in assemblies where every Cossack had a voice. They raided Tatar territories and Ottoman coastal settlements, bringing back plunder and slaves to supplement their meager agricultural production. They served as mercenaries for whoever would pay them. Sometimes fighting for Poland against its enemies, and sometimes fighting against Poland when their own interests demanded it. Their relationship with the Polish crown oscillated between cooperation and conflict, never settling into stable patterns of mutual obligation. The Zaporozhian Sich, the fortified settlement below the Dnieper rapids that served as the Cossacks' main base, became legendary throughout Europe. Foreign visitors described it as a republic of warriors, a community devoted to martial values where men lived without women, without permanent attachments, without anything that might compromise their readiness for combat. This picture was somewhat exaggerated, as many Cossacks maintained families in nearby villages and pursued agriculture alongside their military activities. But the Sich did represent something genuinely distinctive, a form of social organization that rejected the hierarchies and obligations of the surrounding feudal world. For the Orthodox population of Kiev and the Ukrainian lands, the Cossacks represented both hope and danger. They were defenders of the faith, warriors who fought against Catholic Poland and Muslim Tatars alike. But they were also unpredictable allies, capable of turning to violence and plunder with little warning. The relationship between the settled Orthodox communities and the Cossack frontiersmen was complex and ever-shifting, united by shared religious identity and common grievances against Polish rule, divided by different ways of life and different immediate interests. Kiev itself remained a city of modest importance during these centuries, overshadowed by the great Polish centers and by the growing power of Moscow to the northeast. Its population recovered slowly. Its economy remained limited. Its political significance derived more from its symbolic status than from any current power. The metropolitan bishop had long since departed for other seats, first Vladimir and then Moscow, leaving Kiev without even the ecclesiastical centrality it had once possessed. Yet the city endured, its churches still standing, its monasteries still housing communities of monks, its markets still drawing traders from the surrounding countryside. The mother of Russian cities had become a provincial town under foreign rule, but she had not ceased to exist. The pressures building in the Ukrainian lands would eventually explode in one of the most dramatic uprisings in Eastern European history. A Cossack leader would emerge who could unite the frontier warriors with the oppressed peasantry and the persecuted Orthodox Church, forging a movement that would shake the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth to its foundations. That leader was not yet born during these years of accumulating grievance, but the conditions that would make his rebellion possible were being created day by day, policy by policy, injustice by injustice. Kiev would find itself once again at the center of transformative events. Its ancient streets witnessed to another chapter in the endless history of conflict and change. The discontent that had been building for generations finally found its champion in the person of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, a Cossack officer whose personal grievances against Polish authority would ignite a conflagration that transformed the entire region. Khmelnytsky was not a simple frontier warrior, but a man of education and experience, fluent in multiple languages, familiar with the courts of kings and the councils of hetmans. He had served the Polish crown loyally for years, fighting in its wars and navigating the complex politics of the borderlands. But a series of injustices, including the seizure of his estate by a Polish noble and the abduction and death of the woman he loved, turned this capable servant of the Commonwealth into its most dangerous enemy. In 1648, Khmelnytsky fled to the Zaporozhian Sich, the fortified settlement of free Cossacks beyond the Dnieper rapids where Polish authority could not reach. There, he found men eager to follow anyone who promised action against their oppressors. The grievances were countless and deeply felt. Polish nobles had encroached on Cossack lands and privileges. The Catholic Church had seized Orthodox properties and pressured believers to accept the union with Rome. Peasants groaned under labor obligations that grew heavier each year. Jewish merchants and tax collectors, who served as intermediaries for the Polish landlords, became targets of resentment that would soon explode into horrific violence. All these accumulated angers awaited only a spark and a leader to channel them into revolt. Khmelnytsky provided both the spark and the leadership. He secured an alliance with the Crimean Tatars, those Muslim warriors whose raids had long terrorized the region, but who now saw advantage in supporting a rebellion against their common Polish enemy. With this unlikely partnership secured, Khmelnytsky led his forces northward in the spring of 1648, seeking battle with the Polish armies that would surely be sent to crush the uprising. The confrontations that followed exceeded anything the rebels could have hoped for. At Javdi, Vodi, and Korsun, Polish forces were annihilated, their commanders captured, their survivors scattered. The rebellion that had begun as a frontier disturbance suddenly threatened the existence of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth itself. The news of these victories spread like wildfire across the Ukrainian lands, igniting uprisings wherever it reached. Peasants rose against their landlords. Orthodox believers attacked Catholic and Uniat clergy. Communities that had suffered in silence for generations seized the opportunity to take revenge on their oppressors. The violence that accompanied this social explosion was terrible and indiscriminate. Jewish communities, caught between the Polish ruling class they had served and the Ukrainian masses who now rose against that class, suffered massacres of appalling scale. Estimates of Jewish deaths during the Khmelnytsky uprising range from tens of thousands to over 100,000. It's a catastrophe that would be remembered in Jewish memory as one of the darkest chapters before the Holocaust itself. Kiev fell to Khmelnytsky's forces in the early stages of the uprising. Small Polish garrison, unable to resist the tide of rebellion. The Cossack leader entered the city in triumph, greeted as a liberator by the Orthodox population that had endured decades of religious pressure and social subordination. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, who happened to be visiting Kiev at the time, blessed Khmelnytsky and compared him to Moses leading his people out of Egyptian bondage. For a moment, it seemed possible that a new era was dawning, that the Ukrainian lands might throw off foreign domination and establish themselves as an independent power under Cossack leadership. The reality proved far more complicated than this hopeful vision suggested. Khmelnytsky had won spectacular victories, but he lacked the resources to defeat the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth decisively or to establish stable governance over the territories he had liberated. The Tatar alliance was unreliable, as the Crimean Khan pursued his own interests and sometimes abandoned the Cossacks at critical moments. The social forces unleashed by the rebellion were difficult to control, their violence threatening to consume everything in their path. And the Commonwealth, though staggered by its initial defeats, attained substantial military capability and powerful allies who would not allow it to be destroyed. Years of inconclusive warfare followed the initial Cossack triumphs. Battles were won and lost, territories changed hands, and negotiations alternated with renewed fighting without producing any lasting settlement. Khmelnytsky found himself caught between the need to maintain the momentum of rebellion and the impossibility of achieving final victory through military means alone. He sought allies wherever they might be found, negotiating with the Ottoman Empire, with Transylvania, with Sweden, with anyone who might provide the support needed to secure Cossack autonomy. But each potential ally brought complications and demands of their own, and none proved willing or able to deliver the decisive assistance that Khmelnytsky required. The solution that Khmelnytsky ultimately embraced would shape the fate of Ukraine for centuries to come. In January 1654, at the town of Pereyaslav, Cossack leaders gathered to consider an alliance with the Tsardom of Muscovy, the Orthodox power to the northeast that had been gradually expanding its territory and its ambitions. The Muscovites offered military protection against Poland and recognition of Cossack autonomy in exchange for acknowledgement of the Tsar's sovereignty. The exact terms of this agreement, and what each side understood them to mean, would become subjects of bitter dispute in later generations. But in the moment, the Treaty of Pereyaslav seemed to offer the Cossacks what they most needed, a powerful Orthodox ally who could help them resist Catholic Poland. The consequences of Pereyaslav unfolded gradually, but inexorably. Muscovite armies entered the war against Poland, adding their weight to the Cossack cause, but also asserting Muscovite interests that did not always align with Cossack goals. Kiev itself became a contested prize, its symbolic importance exceeding its military or economic value. When negotiations eventually produced a truce in 1667, the Treaty of Andrusovo divided the Ukrainian lands between Poland and Muscovy, with Kiev and the territories east of the Dnieper assigned to Muscovite sovereignty. The mother of Russian cities had passed to the hands of the Tsars, who had proved far more interested in controlling it than the Mongols or Lithuanians had been. Khmelnytsky did not live to see the full consequences of the path he had chosen. He died in 1657, leaving a Cossack state that would struggle for decades to maintain its autonomy against both Polish attempts at reconquest and Muscovite efforts at absorption. His successors, the hetmans who led the Cossack polity, found themselves navigating between powers that each sought to reduce the Cossacks to obedient subjects rather than autonomous allies. Some hetmans tilted toward Poland, some toward Muscovy. Some attempted to chart independent courses that satisfied neither. The period known as the Ruin saw the Ukrainian lands devastated by civil war and foreign intervention, their population declining and their institutions weakening with each passing year. The most dramatic attempt to escape Muscovite domination came under Hetman Ivan Mazepa, cultured and ambitious leader who had served the Tsars faithfully for 2 decades before concluding that Russian sovereignty threatened everything the Cossacks had fought to achieve. When the Great Northern War pitted Sweden's Charles XII against Russia's Peter the Great, Mazepa saw an opportunity to ally with Sweden and secure genuine independence for the Cossack lands. In 1708, he led a portion of the Cossack forces over to the Swedish side, hoping that Swedish military prowess would deliver what Cossack arms alone could not. The gamble failed catastrophically at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. Peter the Great's forces crushed the Swedish army, effectively ending Sweden's era as a great power and confirming Russia's emergence as the dominant force in Eastern Europe. Mazepa escaped the battlefield but died in exile shortly afterward, his name cursed by the Russian Orthodox Church and his memory branded as the archetype of treason. Peter took savage revenge on those who had supported Mazepa, destroying the Zaporozhian Sich and executing Cossack leaders who had followed their hetman into rebellion. The autonomy that had survived decades of conflict was now systematically dismantled. The Cossack hetmanate limped on for another half-century after Poltava, but its independence was a fiction maintained for administrative convenience rather than a political reality. Russian residents, governors, and eventually direct rule replaced the forms of Cossack self-governance that had developed since Khmelnytsky's time. Catherine the Great finally abolished the hetmanate altogether in 1764, incorporating its territories fully into the regular provincial structure of the Russian Empire. The Zaporozhian Sich, reconstituted after Peter's destruction, was eliminated in 1775. Lands distributed to Russian nobles and its Cossack inhabitants, either absorbed into imperial military units or forced to flee to Ottoman territory. Kiev, during these tumultuous centuries, occupied an ambiguous position. It was claimed by all parties as a prize of supreme symbolic importance, yet its actual power and population remained modest compared to the great centers of the competing empires. The city changed hands repeatedly during the wars of the Khmelnytsky era and its aftermath, each new occupier asserting sovereignty that the next would challenge. When Muscovite control became permanent after 1667, the city began a slow integration into the Russian imperial system that would eventually transform it completely. The Orthodox Church provided one continuous thread through all these changes: the Kiev Mohila Academy, founded in 1632, survived war and political upheaval to become the leading center of Orthodox learning in Eastern Europe. Its scholars preserved and transmitted Greek and Latin knowledge, trained clergy for service across the Orthodox world, and maintained intellectual traditions that connected Kiev to the broader currents of European thought. When the Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev was transferred from the jurisdiction of Constantinople to that of Moscow in 1686, the ecclesiastical integration of Ukraine into the Russian Orthodox sphere was formalized, paralleling the political integration that was simultaneously underway. The incorporation of Kiev and the Ukrainian lands into the Russian Empire brought changes that were both destructive and constructive. Traditional Cossack liberties were suppressed, and the peasant population that had hoped the rebellions might bring them freedom instead found themselves enserfed under new masters. The distinctive Ukrainian language and culture were increasingly subordinated to Russian models. Their speakers encouraged or compelled to adopt the language and customs of the imperial center. Yet, the empire also brought peace after generations of devastating warfare, stability that allowed population and economy to recover, and connections to wider networks of trade and ideas. By the end of the 18th century, Kiev had become a provincial city of the Russian Empire. Its Cossack past receding into memory and its future tied to the decisions made in distant St. Petersburg. The mother of Russian cities had become a daughter, subordinate to powers that claimed her heritage while denying her distinctiveness. The transformation was not yet complete, and the 19th century would bring its own developments and conflicts, but the turn to Moscow that Khmelnytsky had initiated at Pereyaslav had worked itself out to conclusions that the great hetman could never have anticipated, binding Ukraine to Russia in ways that would take centuries to fully understand and that remain contested to the present day. The 19th century transformed Kiev from a provincial garrison town into a modern city of industry, education, and imperial ambition. The population that had numbered perhaps 15,000 at the century's opening would multiply tenfold by its close, as migrants from the countryside and settlers from across the empire streamed into a city undergoing rapid physical and social transformation. New districts spread across the hills and valleys, their streets laid out in the geometric patterns favored by imperial planners, their buildings reflecting the architectural fashions of St. Petersburg in Western Europe. The ancient city of wooden churches and earthen fortifications became a metropolis of stone and brick, of factories and railway stations, of universities and theaters. The establishment of St. Vladimir University in 1834 marked a crucial moment in Kiev's emergence as a center of intellectual life. Named for the prince who had baptized the Russlands nearly a millennium earlier, the university drew students and faculty from across the Russian Empire, creating a community of scholars whose interests ranged from classical philology to natural science. The presence of the university stimulated related developments, including libraries, publishing houses, learned societies, and the informal networks of discussion and debate that characterized educated society throughout Europe. Kiev began to develop the characteristics of a true cultural capital, not merely an administrative center, but a place where ideas were generated and contested. The intellectual ferment within the university walls inevitably touched upon questions of identity and nationality. Who were the people of this region, and what relationship did they bear to the broader Russian nation and to the Russian state? These questions had no simple answers, and the attempts to address them generated controversies that would echo through the following century and beyond. Some scholars emphasized the common heritage linking all the lands that had once formed Kievan Rus, viewing the Ukrainian population as a branch of a single Russian people temporarily separated by historical accident. Others began to articulate a distinctly Ukrainian identity rooted in the unique history, language, and folklore of the region. The rediscovery and celebration of Ukrainian folk culture became a significant movement among educated Ukrainians during the middle decades of the century. Scholars collected folk songs, transcribed oral traditions, and published studies of peasant customs that had survived centuries of foreign rule. The poet Taras Shevchenko emerged as the towering figure of this cultural awakening, his verses capturing the beauty of the Ukrainian landscape and the sufferings of the Ukrainian people and language. That moved readers to tears and inspired them to action. Shevchenko's work established Ukrainian as a literary language capable of expressing the full range of human experience, challenging the assumption that it was merely a peasant dialect unsuitable for serious writing. The Russian imperial authorities viewed this Ukrainian cultural revival with deep suspicion. What began as antiquarian interest in folklore could easily develop into political nationalism, threatening the unity of an empire that depended on the loyalty of its diverse populations. A series of decrees progressively restricted the use of Ukrainian in public life, banning its use in education, prohibiting the publication of Ukrainian language books on certain subjects, and generally treating expressions of Ukrainian distinctiveness as potentially subversive. The EM's decree of 1876 represented the culmination of these restrictive policies, essentially attempting to suppress Ukrainian as a written language entirely. These prohibitions did not extinguish Ukrainian consciousness, but rather drove it underground and, paradoxically, strengthened it. Forbidden literature acquired the allure of the forbidden, while the very fact of persecution demonstrated that the authorities considered Ukrainian identity significant enough to fear. Intellectuals, who might have been content with cultural activities, found themselves pushed toward political opposition by policies that criminalized their scholarly, literary interests. The seeds of Ukrainian nationalism, planted in the relatively innocuous soil of folklore studies, were watered by repression into more robust and politically dangerous growth. Kiev's physical transformation accelerated in the decades following the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. The abolition of serfdom set in motion massive population movements as freed peasants sought opportunities beyond their native villages. Many gravitated toward cities, providing labor for the factories and workshops that were beginning to dot the urban landscape. Kiev's location made it a natural hub for the processing of agricultural products from the surrounding Black Earth region, one of the most fertile areas in the entire Russian Empire. Sugar refineries, flour mills, and related industries established themselves in the city, creating an industrial working class that lived in conditions far removed from the elegant districts where the wealthy made their homes. The railway arrived in Kiev in 1868, connecting the city to the imperial network that was rapidly binding together the vast Russian state. Trains brought goods and people with unprecedented speed and reliability, making Kiev a junction point for traffic moving in all directions. The bridge across the Dnieper that the railway required became one of the engineering marvels of its age, demonstrating what modern technology could achieve when backed by imperial resources. Other infrastructure followed: telegraph lines, improved water systems, gas lighting that gradually gave way to electricity, paved streets where mud had previously reigned supreme. Kiev was becoming modern, was becoming European, was becoming a city that visitors from Western capitals could recognize as belonging to their own world. The turn of the century brought both continued growth and mounting tensions. The city's population approached 500,000, a remarkable expansion that strained housing, sanitation, and social services. The Jewish community, which had grown substantially despite discriminatory laws, contributed significantly to commerce and professional life, while also experiencing periodic outbursts of anti-Semitic violence. Revolutionary movements found adherents among students and workers. Their underground cells plotting the overthrow of the autocracy that seemed increasingly incapable of addressing the empire's accumulated problems. Kiev was not immune to the revolutionary ferment that was building throughout Russia, its streets witnessing demonstrations and its prisons holding political detainees. The First World War brought devastation that exceeded anything the city had experienced since the Mongol invasion. The front lines of the Eastern European theater passed not far from Kiev, and the city served as a major logistical center for Russian military operations. Refugees from combat zones flooded in, straining resources already stretched thin by wartime demands. The economy dislocated as normal commerce gave way to the imperatives of military supply. Food grew scarce, prices rose, and the population suffered privations that bred resentment against a government seemingly incapable of managing the crisis it had brought upon itself. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 opened possibilities that had seemed unimaginable just months before. The February Revolution overthrew the Tsar, replacing autocracy with a provisional government that promised democratic reforms and civil liberties. For Ukrainian activists, this transformation created space to pursue goals that imperial repression had long frustrated. Cultural organizations flourished, political parties formed, and calls for Ukrainian autonomy or independence found increasingly receptive audiences. In Kiev, a body called the Central Rada emerged as the voice of Ukrainian aspirations, initially seeking autonomy within a reformed Russian state, but moving toward full independence as circumstances evolved. The Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd in October 1917 complicated an already chaotic situation. The Rada refused to recognize Bolshevik authority, declaring Ukraine an independent republic in January 1918. For a brief moment, Kiev served as the capital of a sovereign Ukrainian state, its institutions attempting to establish the apparatus of governance amidst conditions of near-total disorder. But independence existed more on paper than in reality. As the new state lacked the military force to defend its proclaimed boundaries against the multiple armies contending for control of the region, the years that followed brought Kiev a succession of rulers in bewildering sequence. Bolshevik forces captured the city in February 1918, only to be expelled weeks later when German troops arrived under the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Germans installed a conservative regime headed by Pavel Skoropadsky, a former Tsarist general who took the historical title of Hetman. When Germany collapsed in November 1918, Skoropadsky fell with his patrons, placed by a nationalist directorate that struggled to maintain authority as civil war engulfed the region. Bolsheviks, White Russian forces, Polish armies, various Ukrainian factions all occupied the city at different moments between 1918 and 1920, each bringing their own violence and their own brief attempts at administration. The Bolsheviks ultimately prevailed, incorporating Ukraine into the Soviet state as a theoretically sovereign republic within the larger Union. Kiev became the capital of Soviet Ukraine in 1934, when the seat of government was transferred from Kharkiv, marking a symbolic acknowledgement of the city's historical significance. But the Soviet transformation of Ukraine brought horrors that dwarfed even the chaos of the Civil War years. Collectivization of agriculture, implemented with brutal force in the early 1930s, destroyed the traditional peasant economy and created conditions for catastrophic famine. Holodomor, the terror famine of 1932 to 1933, killed millions of Ukrainians in what many scholars now recognize as a deliberate act of genocide. Soviet authorities extracted grain from the Ukrainian countryside, even as people starved, sealed borders to prevent the starving from seeking food elsewhere, and suppressed information about the catastrophe, both domestically and internationally. Kiev itself did not experience the worst of the famine, which fell most heavily on the grain-producing rural regions, but the city was surrounded by death. Peasants who managed to reach urban areas were rounded up and returned to villages where no food remained. The true scale of the death toll may never be known with certainty, but estimates range from 3 to 7 million dead. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 brought yet another catastrophe to Kiev and its people. German forces approached the city in August, and the Soviet defense, though fierce, could not prevent its fall. The city was captured on September 19, 1941, after weeks of fighting that left much of the urban fabric in ruins. What followed was among the worst atrocities of a war defined by atrocities. Within days of taking Kiev, the German occupiers began the systematic murder of the city's Jewish population. Babi Yar was a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, an unremarkable landscape feature that would become synonymous with industrial-scale murder. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, German SS units and their collaborators shot 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children at this site, the largest single massacre of the Holocaust. Victims were ordered to assemble, told they were being resettled, marched to the ravine's edge, forced to strip, and shot in groups that fell into the pit below. Those who survived the initial volleys were buried alive beneath the bodies of the dead. The killing continued at Babi Yar throughout the occupation, claiming Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, psychiatric patients, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The total death toll at this single site may have exceeded 100,000. The German occupation lasted until November 1943, when Soviet forces finally liberated the devastated city. Kiev emerged from the war with much of its physical fabric destroyed, its population drastically reduced, and its surviving inhabitants traumatized by experiences that defied comprehension. The Soviet regime that reclaimed the city had no interest in acknowledging the specifically Jewish character of the Babi Yar massacres, preferring to memorialize the dead as Soviet citizens without ethnic distinction. The full truth of what had occurred would remain suppressed for decades, its memory kept alive primarily by survivors and by brave individuals who risked official displeasure to bear witness. The city that emerged from the Second World War bore scars both visible and invisible. Bombed-out buildings would take years to rebuild or replace. The demographic losses, coming on top of the Holodomor's devastation, had transformed the character of the population. The vibrant Jewish community that had contributed so much to Kiev's intellectual and commercial life had been almost entirely annihilated. The Ukrainian peasantry that had formed the backbone of the surrounding countryside had been decimated by famine and war. What remained was a population reshaped by catastrophe, living in a city that would be rebuilt according to Soviet plans, but could never recover what had been lost. The reconstruction of Kiev began even before the last echoes of war had faded, as Soviet planners set about transforming the ruined city into a showcase of socialist achievement. Brigades of workers cleared rubble from the streets, salvaging what materials could be reused and carting away the rest. New buildings rose according to designs that reflected Stalinist aesthetics, their facades decorated with columns, friezes, and other classical elements that proclaimed the grandeur of the Soviet state. The central thoroughfare, renamed Cossack after the ancient stream that had once flowed through the area, was rebuilt as a magnificent boulevard lined with imposing structures that housed government offices, shops, and apartments for privileged citizens. The post-war decades brought steady growth and increasing prosperity, at least by Soviet standards. Heavy industry expanded, providing employment for workers who migrated from the countryside in search of better lives. Educational institutions multiplied, training engineers, scientists, teachers, and administrators for the vast Soviet bureaucracy. The city's population, which had fallen catastrophically during the war, covered and then exceeded its pre-war levels, reaching over 2 million by the 1980s. Kiev became one of the major cities of the Soviet Union, third in importance after Moscow and Leningrad, the capital of a republic that contributed significantly to Soviet economic and military power. Yet beneath the surface of socialist normality, tensions persisted that the official ideology could neither acknowledge nor resolve. Ukrainian identity had not been extinguished by decades of Soviet rule. Despite policies that promoted Russian language and culture at the expense of local traditions, the memory of the Holodomor, though officially suppressed, survived in family stories and private commemorations, a wound that could not heal because it could not be openly discussed. Dissidents who dared to challenge Soviet orthodoxy faced imprisonment, eternal exile, or confinement in psychiatric hospitals where political nonconformity was treated as mental illness. The system maintained control through a combination of genuine achievements, pervasive surveillance, and the threat of punishment for those who stepped out of line. The catastrophe that would ultimately help bring down the entire Soviet system occurred not in Kiev itself, but close enough to transform the city's fate. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a safety test, releasing massive quantities of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The plant was located roughly 100 kilometers north of Kiev, close enough that prevailing winds could carry contamination directly over the capital. Yet Soviet authorities initially concealed the scale of the disaster, allowing the traditional May Day celebrations to proceed in Kiev, even as invisible poison drifted through the air above the parading crowds. The full truth about Chernobyl emerged only gradually, as the scale of the contamination became impossible to hide, and as the policy of glasnost, or openness, that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had initiated began to create space for honest discussion of the regime's failures. The revelation that authorities had knowingly exposed millions of people to radiation while maintaining a facade of normalcy devastated whatever remaining trust existed between the Soviet state and its citizens. If the government would lie about something so fundamental, so directly threatening to life itself, then nothing it said could be believed. Chernobyl became a symbol of systemic dysfunction, a regime so committed to maintaining its image that it would sacrifice the health of its own people rather than admit the truth. The years following Chernobyl witnessed an accelerating unraveling of Soviet power. Gorbachev's reforms, intended to revitalize the system, instead exposed its contradictions and weaknesses. Nationalist movements gained strength in republic after republic, demanding autonomy or independence from a center that seemed increasingly incapable of commanding obedience. In Ukraine, a popular movement called Rock emerged in 1989, initially focused on cultural and environmental issues, but rapidly developing into a vehicle for political transformation. As demonstrations filled the streets of Kiev, their participants demanding rights that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The attempted coup against Gorbachev in August 1991 precipitated the final collapse. When hardline communists tried to seize power in Moscow, the Ukrainian parliament responded by declaring independence on August 24, 1991. A referendum held in December confirmed this declaration by an overwhelming margin, with over 90% of voters supporting independence. Kiev, which had served for 7 decades as the capital of a Soviet republic, became the capital of a sovereign nation. The blue and yellow flag that had briefly flown over an independent Ukraine in 1918 was raised once again, this time over a state that would prove more durable than its predecessor. The early years of independence brought hardships that tested the new nation severely. The Soviet economic system, whatever its flaws, had provided a framework within which production and distribution occurred. Its collapse left Ukraine struggling to build market institutions from scratch, while coping with the disruption of established relationships with other former Soviet republics. Hyperinflation devastated savings. Unemployment rose as inefficient enterprises closed, and corruption flourished in the chaotic conditions of transition. Kiev, as the capital and largest city, experienced these difficulties intensely, its population struggling to adapt to circumstances that changed faster than anyone could comprehend. The privatization of state assets created a new class of wealthy businessmen, the oligarchs, whose fortunes derived from acquiring valuable enterprises at far below their actual worth. These oligarchs accumulated economic power that translated readily into political influence, creating a system in which formal democratic institutions coexisted with informal networks of patronage and corruption. Presidents came and went, each promising reform and each disappointing those who had hoped for genuine transformation. The gap between the democratic ideals proclaimed in official rhetoric and the oligarchic reality of actual governance bred cynicism among a population that had already learned to distrust authority under Soviet rule. The Orange Revolution of 2004 represented a dramatic assertion of popular will against this entrenched system. When the presidential election of that year was blatantly falsified to deny victory to the opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko, hundreds of thousands of citizens gathered in Kiev's Independence Square, known as the Maidan, to demand that their votes be respected. For weeks, despite freezing temperatures, the protesters maintained their vigil, their presence forcing a revote that ultimately installed Yushchenko as president. The orange scarves and banners that demonstrators wore became symbols of peaceful revolution, of people power triumphing over corrupt authority. Kiev was once again the stage for historic events. Its central square transformed into a forum where the fate of a nation was decided. The hopes generated by the Orange Revolution faded as the new government proved unable to overcome the structural problems that had plagued its predecessors. Yushchenko and his allies quarreled among themselves, dissipating political capital in personal conflicts, while the oligarchic system adapted to new circumstances without fundamentally changing the man whose falsified election had sparked the revolution. Viktor Yanukovych returned to power through legitimate elections in 2010, demonstrating that democratic processes alone could not guarantee democratic outcomes. Ukraine remained caught between its European aspirations and its entanglement with Russia, between the desire for transformation and the inertia of established interests. The crisis that erupted in late 2013 would prove even more consequential than the Orange Revolution, when Yanukovych rejected an association agreement with the European Union, choosing instead to accept Russian financial support. Protesters returned to the Maidan in numbers that eventually exceeded those of Constantinople. 2004. What began as a demonstration in favor of European integration evolved into a broader uprising against the corruption and authoritarianism. The Yanukovych regime, the government's violent response, which killed over 100 protesters in February 2014, only intensified the opposition. Yanukovych fled to Russia, and a new government came to power committed to the European path that the protests had demanded. The aftermath of the Euromaidan brought consequences that continued to shape Ukraine's present. Russia responded to the change of government by annexing Crimea and supporting armed separatists in the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. A war began that would claim thousands of lives and displace millions of people. It's a conflict that remained unresolved as Ukraine struggled to defend its territorial integrity against a far more powerful neighbor. Kiev, though distant from the front lines, became a city at war, its politics dominated by questions of national survival, its young men called to serve in a conflict that showed no signs of ending. Through all these transformations, the city endured as cities endure, by the persistent presence of people who make their lives within its boundaries, regardless of what flags fly above government buildings. The hills that had attracted settlers since before recorded history continued to rise above the Dnieper. The river continued its ancient flow toward the Black Sea, indifferent to the empires that had risen and fallen along its banks. The churches that had survived Mongol destruction and Soviet atheism continued to shelter those who sought connection to the divine. The monastery of the caves continued to draw pilgrims who descended into its underground passages to venerate the relics of medieval saints. Kiev has been called the mother of Russian cities, a title bestowed by Prince Oleg when he seized the city over 1100 years ago. This designation reflects a historical reality, acknowledging Kiev's role as the birthplace of the civilization that would eventually produce the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian nations. But the phrase has also been wielded as a political weapon, invoked to justify claims of ownership over a city and a land that have their own distinct identity and their own right to self-determination. The argument over who can legitimately claim Kiev's heritage is not merely academic, but lies at the heart of conflicts that continue to claim lives in the present day. What Kiev's long history reveals is the persistence of place through the succession of peoples and powers that have contested its possession. The Polans, who first settled the hills, gave way to the Varangians, who made them the capital of a medieval empire. The Mongol devastation reduced the city to a village, but it rose again under Lithuanian and Polish rule. The Cossacks fought for its liberation, only to see it absorbed by a Russian empire that would itself give way to the Soviet Union. Independence brought new hopes and new conflicts, but through it all, the city remained, adapting to each new reality while preserving something essential that linked its present to its past. The golden domes of St. Sophia still catch the sunlight, as they have for nearly 1,000 years. The ancient mosaics still depict the Virgin with arms upraised, the unbreakable wall, who has watched over the city through invasions, revolutions, and catastrophes beyond counting. The Dnieper still reflects the sky, its waters flowing past the very hills where legend says 3 brothers, K, and their sister founded a settlement that would become the mother of cities. Whatever futures await Kiev, whatever transformations, technology, and politics may bring, these continuities will remain, connecting the people of tomorrow to the people of all the yesterdays that have made this place what it is. To tell the history of Kiev is to tell the history of Eastern Europe itself. So intimately is the city connected to the great currents of change that have swept across the region. Empires have claimed it, religions have contested it, ideologies have sought to remake it in their own images. It has known golden ages and dark centuries, moments of glory and periods of desolation. It has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that destruction and rebuilding have become part of its essential character. And through it all, through the seemingly endless succession of conquerors and liberators, the city has maintained its identity, has continued to be Kiev, has continued to be home to those who call it home. The story does not end here, because stories of living cities never end. Tomorrow will bring its own events, its own challenges, its own transformations that no historian can predict. Kiev will continue to change, will continue to adapt, will continue to be shaped by forces, both local and global, that interact in ways too complex for any single narrative to capture. But the past remains present in the streets and buildings, in the memories and traditions, in the very name that connects a modern capital to a legendary founder whose historicity we can never confirm. Kiev endures, as it has endured, as it will endure, the mother of cities standing watch over the Dnieper, waiting for whatever the future will bring.